Turn your mind on and your TV off. It's time to hear the real truth behind what's really going on. Join Tia Severino, an advocate for truth, freedom, and spiritual growth, as she explores the real story behind what we are made to believe on her show, The People's Truth. In the next hour, you'll be exposed to shocking revelations, to lies you have believed in all your life. Together with her guests, she will unravel the facts behind the current events, health, wellness, faith, justice, and more. As Orwell said, in a time of universal deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act. Join the conversation, leave a comment, or call in live 678-495-4345. Don't forget to like, share, and help spread the great message out. And now, here's Tia Severino.
Hello, and welcome to The People's Truth, where we dig deep into the issues that are really affecting our world. I'm your host, Tia Severino, and in this very special episode, not only are we marking 1 year since the pilot episode of The People's Truth, where I interviewed one of the most highly controversial and heavily censored doctors, my dear friend, Dr. Judy. Today, I'm so excited to share the conversation I had with another highly censored doctor, Dr. Lee. Last year, Dr. Lee stood with her colleagues in front of the U.S. Supreme Court to deliver a message of hope to the American people that there are effective treatments for the virus currently terrifying the planet. Their message that we do not have to live in fear because there are inexpensive and highly effective treatments available. This message was immediately censored across all social media and, of course, completely ignored by the mainstream press. Due to scheduling conflicts, I was not able to have Dr. Lee on the show live. I sat down with her last week and recorded this interview, which was meant to be an hour, but ran over to 90 minutes. Knowing that I would need to edit, I uploaded the raw video to my own personal YouTube channel so that I could get some feedback from a friend on what to save and what to cut. Within a short time, YouTube had removed the raw interview. So then I tried to share it with her using Google Drive. Again, and this was really eerie. The video was unable to be shared as it had been flagged as inappropriate. This blew my mind, and it should really shock you too, because it means that Google is scanning our personal and private files and determining which files we can share among ourselves using their platform. So I'm saying all of that to tell you that after all this, we decided that instead of censoring Dr. Lee, we are bringing you the entire unedited 90-minute interview. What this means is that while you may be watching this on social media, due to the content, I do not expect it to stay up on YouTube or Facebook. So you need to head over to uimedianetwork.org to watch and share this very important information. And now, without further delay, here is part one of my interview with Dr. Lee.
I was on a podcast a few weeks ago, and they kind of got me connected, so I was able to ask some questions of Dr. Andrew Kaufman that I've admired from afar, but got to really chat with. You know, and he's one of the people that have been saying, wait a minute, we have not isolated the virus. And he and his, I think, colleague or partner, Dr. Cohen, have come out now with a position statement that people can sign on to that go through, in fact, his concerns, and he has more biology background than I do, about have we really isolated this virus? And he goes through highly technical stuff, but he says basically they haven't used the basic principles for isolation of a pathogen that we would consider really isolating a pathogen, meaning getting the pure germ that's causing the disease, really identifying it. And, you know, so I talked to him about technical things, but I think he's right. I have just tried to, it's hard to say, when you look at science, it's hard to say, oh, there's no evidence. I hear people all the time saying, oh, there's no evidence for that. No, that means you don't know of any evidence. I want to make sure the evidence is not out there, but it's true. I cannot find where people, they may say they've isolated it, but as he points out, they don't use the techniques that we would really trust. So, and when you look at this, here's what we're faced with. We're not sure we really have a disease that makes sense, that really exists in the way they're telling us it does. We have totally kind of skewed what makes a difference. They haven't told you what makes a difference for this disease, and they've falsified the information about what we know helps this treatment of whatever this is, making people better. We know there's a virus or something out there that's doing it, but it may not be exactly the one we think it is. And then the question is, if you don't, because the other problem is we have testing that we really don't understand, or we're pretty sure it's been false. PCR testing, I said a long time ago, could be manipulated. You know, if you cycle it too many times, you get false positives. If you cycle it too few times, you get false negatives. So what are you really looking at? Well, you're looking at a disease we haven't identified for sure. There's no gold standard to make a test with which to gauge the test. And then you have a test that has been turned way up to give you a lot of false positives. So our numbers are in question. What do we know here? And now we've got these, they're not really vaccines, and I'm not going to use that term. These are experimental genetic agents that we don't know what's in them. You know, there's so many things we are not being told and we don't understand here. It's like there are more questions than there are answers. And I think that's a sign of something shady here going on, quite frankly. But I think when you really look at this, what do we really know? We really know that Wuhan was the first city to roll out 5G. And I'm just throwing this in. I'm not saying I think this is what happened. I'm just telling you what we know for sure. We know that Wuhan was the first fully implemented 5G city in China, maybe in the world, but at least in China. And that the hospital where Dr. Li first reported this disease was the first fully implemented hospital. Now, we also know that something happened and a lot of people got very ill. We also know that it seemed to spread to other countries, such as Italy, where there was a direct communication to China, and to New York City, that there was a direct communication of the very first people getting sick when they hadn't cut off transportation. They went back and forth, and we had some outbreaks there. Now, beyond that, what do we really know? We know that there are some quirky things about this disease. So, for example, in flu, and in all fairness, it may be that we weren't thinking about these things with flu, but we know a lot about influenza. We kind of see it every year. People are, even me, I mean, I'm a surgeon. I just got out of the OR. It's not that we don't see flu, but I'm not an infectious disease specialist. So maybe the guys that see flu can say more about this. But my impression is this selects out some people to make very, very sick that we didn't see with the flu, specifically obese people and people with a propensity for type A blood. I've never heard that with flu, but that seems to be true with this. We did know about low vitamin D. We know that low vitamin D is the key, is one of those are the three things we know. We know obesity, type A blood, and low vitamin D are the big three risk factors. And there are some more maybe, but those are by and far outweigh everything else. And the magic number we know for vitamin D levels is 30. That's based on the Indonesian study where they looked at 700 and some people in their hospital. You know, the CDC, we also know that the CDC hasn't done one thing in our best interest here. They haven't controlled this disease, and they haven't told us how to help ourselves. But the Indonesians did. They looked at who's dying of this, who's in their ICU, and who is just walking away from this. Because, you know, the majority of people that get this is also what we know, the vast majority of people do not get sick, end up in the ICU, or die. They get a mild disease and they walk away from it. At the worst, most people get it's a flu-like illness. They stay at home, they get better, and it goes away. But who are those people? So they looked at who the people in their hospital was that walked away and who the people were that ended up in the hospital or dead. I mean, in the ICU or dead. And it turns out the magic number is if your vitamin D level is above 30, your chance of going to the ICU or dying is less than 4%. That's a pretty good hedge. You know, I'll take 96.2% in my favor by getting my vitamin D up. The other thing we know is that 50% of the people that are dying have low zinc levels. So I guess the other thing we know for sure, and I think this is, to me, I think this is for sure. I think there's been a lot of disinformation out there, but when you really look at the literature, and I trust the group that looked at this worldwide, honestly, with open architecture study, they showed that if you are from a country that uses hydroxychloroquine early and often, they're used to using it. It turns out that they actually had a 78% less mortality from this disease than do countries that don't do that. So when I looked at it, the worst place in the world to be was in New York State. It was 0.17% mortality rate, which means you still had a 99.83 chance of survival if you were a New York State resident in 2020. But where's the best place to be? It's Uganda. Think about that. Because although you're not free in New York State to buy this, or in Nebraska, or into any place else in America, in Uganda, you can walk down to your corner drugstore and buy hydroxychloroquine over the counter and most other things. You have to ask yourself, why are we not able to do that? So those are the things I absolutely know about this. And I would say too, I think we absolutely know that this was not a natural occurring pathogen, that there is something. How it relates, the problem we don't know is how what we know about SARS-CoV-2 relates to the disease we call COVID. So I've been discussing the disease we called COVID. If you really look at the season overall in morbidity, mortality, especially mortality, in 2020, from January to August, so certainly through a standard viral season, we had a 99.991% overall survivability of that disease. And flu normally is 99.992% survivable. So you see a big difference there? No. I mean, it's really very, very sketchy that this is a lot different than flu. It does take some people down a little differently. And I think the people that see the difference mostly are people that do work in the ICUs. They're seeing a little different population of people, a little younger, some of them, and like I say, obese young people that are being taken down with this more than they did with flu. But other than that, there's not that huge, the overall mortality of this is not that different. And if we were left to our own and had freedom, we could have taken care of this very easily. Now, here's the other point. Now they want us to have experimental injections. And the other thing we know for sure is that these are unproven experimental agents. This has never been used in humans before. It's never passed long-term animal testing. The animals died. It's got chemicals, constituents in here that have individually never been used, like polyethylene glycol that is highly allergic to a lot of people. So you have to have these injections in a place where you have to be able to be resuscitated. What does that say? So this is a novel idea that hasn't been used before, and yet we are rolling it out to the whole world without long-term animal or long-term small group human testing. That's pretty shocking to me. It turns out we could have gotten rid of this virus. If you think about this, March, we could have given everybody in the country over the age of 17 24 tablets of hydroxychloroquine and told them, you take one tablet twice a week, like on Mondays and Thursdays, for the next 12 weeks. Well, it would have been over, because what we also know is we cannot find an animal host of this. There are no, unlike a really what we call a zoonosis, an animal disease that's native that might have slipped into us, it could cross species. This has they've never found an intermediate host. None of the animals in the Wuhan meat market test positive for this, and they cannot retroactively take what they think is SARS-CoV-2 and infect bat cells. So this, if you get rid of it in humans, it's gone. Just like SARS, apparently. You get rid of it in humans, it's gone. So they could have treated everybody in the United States for 12 weeks and it would have been gone. Think of the economy we could have saved. Think of all the suicides and all the junk that could have happened to us. So, I mean, in this section of what we do know, I would say we could have done this better. And it's hard to believe this was an accidental mistake on everybody's part in medical administration, medical politics, because Tony Fauci and these guys, they're not dumb. They couldn't have possibly, on random chance alone, if they'd cared about our safety and welfare, they would have done one thing in our interest, and they didn't. So that's my summary of what I think we know about this at this point.
So, let me see if I got that all wrapped up in my mind about right. So it looks like it was not naturally
Right.
And naturally, it looks like it was cooked up in a lab. We know that there's a history in North Carolina at one of the universities where they were doing some gain of function with regards to this, and it was shut down. I believe that was during Obama's presidency. It was shut down and moved to Wuhan, and Fauci was in. Didn't he give like 4
Well, he actually, that's no, this is another thing. So this
million or billion?
also we know,
4 million.
right. We also know this. So what happened really was that Dr. Fauci's NIAID, and he must have been involved in this personally, one would think, granted Ralph Barrick at the Gilling School of Health Science or something like that at Chapel Hill, North Carolina, University of North Carolina, $10-something million to look at these type of pathogens. He was known as Mr. Bat Coronavirus. And he said on his website, hey, they were bragging about how they got all this money from NIAID, and they're going to look at bat coronavirus and they're going to look at these, I can't remember if he mentioned HIV, but he mentioned a couple other things that they were going to look at what he was describing is upregulating. Okay. So gain of function research. He was going to combine these different viruses together, looking at what pathogens could be out there, and he's going to do gain of function research. Well, what happened was, as soon as the money was apportioned to him, somebody pointed out to Dr. Fauci that, wait a minute, recently that was made illegal. It didn't used to be, but then recently, I think under the Obama administration, that gain of function research had been made illegal. So what they did first is they gave Dr. Barrick a pass. They let him continue because they said, actually, well, he started this before the ban, so we'll let him have that and keep going. But to hedge his bets, about the same time, he gave $3.7 million to the Wuhan for the lab to work on setting up the lab in Wuhan. And then he also in 2019 redid that $3.7 million. And this was theoretically the first to research bat coronavirus in the wild out there. And the person involved in that was Dr. Xi. She's a Chinese People's Liberation Army viral researcher. Now, some of that money, I think, also paid her to come and to work in, what's his name? I'll think of it, just Frank Plummer's lab in Winnipeg. It was their only level 4 research lab in Winnipeg, in Canada. And she was going back and forth there. And also, believe it or not, she was coming to our bioweapons lab, which they might call it biodefense, but it's the Fort Detrick USAMRIID, which is that's the Army Fort Detrick, basically the bioweapons lab, where they do high level pathogens like Ebola, like Marburg, and she was working on Marburg. So she was funded to literally come to our lab. Now, under President Clinton, that was highly illegal. You couldn't have anybody from a non-allied country actually working in a lab, any lab, even the State University of Nebraska or Iowa or someplace that was working with, like they have anthrax, for example, in Iowa. That's a big deal they study. You could not have, theoretically, under the Clinton administration, they made it illegal for somebody from Iran or North Korea or China or something to come and work in those labs because of the potential for creating a bioweapon. But no, it was completely allowed not only to come to those, but to have people come and work in our Army bioweapons lab. That's just the height of insanity. And so what happened with her, and I traced this, I had all this by February of 2020, and nobody would publish my little article on the timeline because they thought it was just, oh, that can't be true. That's just too conspiratorial. But this is just the facts. Then some of the pathogen that she was working on with Frank Plummer, who, by the way, went over to Saudi Arabia and picked up a sample of MERS. MERS was a very deadly version of SARS type virus. It was a coronavirus. There was SARS in 2004, then there was MERS, Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, in 2014, roughly. And they were from little different animal hosts, but MERS turned out to be a pretty deadly disease. So he got pieces of that and brought it over, some samples of that, what he thought was from a guy's lung, and brought it to the Winnipeg lab and was working on it. And she came over to work on it with him. And then they found that there were samples of this that somehow made their way back to Wuhan. and around the world, the virologists that were watching all this show, they kind of saw this and said, "Wait, what's happening to you guys? What are you doing up there in Winnipeg?" So they kind of got caught letting her go back, or she stole it, or who knows. But there was no investigation of her. There was no citation of her. Basically, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police ushered her out of the lab, and then she just went back to China, where she's remained behind the bamboo curtain ever since. And coincidentally, when this whole thing started blowing up, that was in 2019, when this whole thing started blowing up in 2020, and in February 4th of 2020, Dr. Plummer just miraculously drops dead on a speaking tour. He didn't appear sick before, but he drops dead in Africa on a lecture tour. So they've it looks a lot like one of those spy novels where they cut away all the trail that you can follow here, so there's a lot of that going around. So yes, when people were pointing their fingers in last spring and when it first came out at China, I kept saying, whoa, let's back off a little bit, because I'm going to tell you, there's plenty of finger pointing to go around. And not to mention Charles Lieber, Dr. Lieber at Harvard, the chief of biochemistry, biology at Harvard, who got caught not only working for our DOD, taking $11 million in grants from our DOD the same year, he was a member of the Chinese 1,000 Talents program. And the 1,000 Talents program actually pay you bonuses for stealing and sharing proprietary scientific knowledge with your Chinese handlers. This stuff is treasonous. It's unbelievable that we're doing this, but it's unbelievable we allow people. So again, and by the way, his graduate student from China got caught in Logan Airport in Boston trying to smuggle out a bunch of specimens. So God knows who's in all the labs around the country doing this. This is just the tip of the iceberg, unfortunately.
Wow. And it is, like you said, very much like a spy novel, except that if somebody wrote a spy novel like this, it would be, I think, unbelievable.
Yeah.
The part that I find the most unbelievable is that people they're not digging deeper. They're
right.
people that should have a healthy dose of skepticism about our government and pharma and, well, let's just say the elite who run the world are just falling in line. And it's like, oh yeah, whatever Dr. Fauci and whatever they say on CNN is the truth. But so what I've felt from the beginning that this was a lab manipulated virus. I actually predicted that something like this would happen. I've been saying for years, they've been cooking up things in labs. And I think that the biggest issue that they have is that humans are too resilient. They really thought that this was going to be the one that was going to kill millions of people. I mean, I think they were literally drooling at the idea of killing, 2.5 million people in America. But alas, humans are too resilient, and so it seems to be a dud. But that they're not going to waste the political investment, the capital, the political. They're going to take advantage of it. But I just am, it blows my mind that people are not questioning more, and they are just going right along with it. So how do we get this information out there? How do we wake up the average person to say, listen, it's not only is it not what you think it is, it's not as big a deal as you think it is. Like really, most people who, if you have the extremely rare luck to encounter this, which I don't know what's circulating, but I know that I don't trust the tests. I don't trust the test. I'm pretty sure that if you go and get a test and it tells you that it's positive, it doesn't mean you have the SARS-CoV-2, the virus that they supposedly isolated in Wuhan, China, if it's even that anymore, but it gets you pulled into the whole treatment and tracking and all that kind of crazy stuff. So,
well, and I think honestly, I don't think it's, my head blew open when I realized they'd been lying to us for 40 years about hydroxychloroquine. In summary, they turned out they knew about these drugs at least back to 1974. They knew that in theory they could treat viruses with antimicrobial agents, and they didn't tell us. They didn't tell medical students. They didn't tell, people in medical education, people in pharmaceutical education. They have hidden this. They kept it out of the literature, both basic science and medical science. This is a big lie, perhaps the biggest lie they pulled off. And it couldn't have been by accident. This took some juice at high level, like you say, the elite that rule the world. Here's the problem I think people have in really getting what's going on here. One is we have been totally conditioned to just believe that we have a system where most medicine that's being given to us is being given in good faith by pharmaceutical industries that really try to produce things in good faith, that there's no big cabal overseeing this that would want to do us harm. What would be the point? I think that's one of the things that it's hard for people to understand, that there might be a different motive here. And the reason I say that is, think what they've done. If your point was very good, maybe they thought this was going to kill more of the people than it was, okay? But what happens when viruses even come out in nature, this is just a natural evolutionary point of viruses, and that is, if they're too deadly, they don't spread. So if you are the Napoleon of viruses and you want to take over the world, what you have to do is you have to decide that you're going to become more transmissible but less deadly. That's a good evolutionary step for you, but not the other way around. You don't want to kill the first person you come to. You're going nowhere. You're never going to be, you're never progeny. You're not going to be existent. You're never going to be seen again. So all viruses generally attenuate. They get weaker as they pass through human hosts. As did, I think, this. This was worse when it came through Lombardy and New York, but it's not so bad now. But the other thing to say here is that if you look at the history of medicine, I have to say, not only do I ask myself, what did they do right here on this outbreak? But in general, what have they been doing with our health through the pharmaceutical industries and through our chemical industries since 1900, say? And it seems like everything they do, and they do it by commission, meaning they give us things that are bad for us, and they do it by omission, by purposely not telling us about the things that are good for us or denying that they're good for us. And I'll tell you some examples of those. So I've had this little kind of nagging little idea in the back of my head that, like, are they trying to damage our immune system over, a long time? So, and I kind of have to come to the conclusion that if they weren't, again, you would think that on random chance alone, they'd have done something to strengthen our immune system. It's provable that your immune system is not overall healthier if you're being given a rash of all sorts of vaccines. We have not done studies. Well, we have now actually looked at some of this, but for a long time, we never did studies on non-vaccinated children. There is a group now, I think, working with Robert Kennedy Jr. that have looked at that and have concluded that you are much healthier if you don't take all these vaccines. But they're the only group that looked at the effect on the health of people who are vaccinated versus having no vaccines. And they've always in the past looked at a false negative control that actually was a vaccine of a different type. Well, there's that. And then there's, wheat in our diet. It turns out they've hybridized wheat to a point that it's not genetically food, and it's got chemicals in it that make little pores open up in your bowel and produce a chemical that gets out into your bloodstream that's associated with MS, Alzheimer's, and ALS. Again, maybe that's not accidental that's accidental by itself. Then glyphosate. What's glyphosate do? Well, correct. Monsanto's correct. Glyphosate doesn't bother your cells, but it bothers the cells of your gut flora, your bacteria, which we've known since a long, long time ago. In the 1880s, and I'm trying to think of the name, he's a famous Russian biologist, and he coined the term probiotic. He said someday he realized that the people in the Caucasus that ate yogurt were longer lived, and he said it's probably the bacteria and things or the germs that live in yogurt, whatever it is in yogurt. And someday we'll figure it out, and we'll combine that in a probiotic, and we'll all be healthier. He knew what was going on just by actually reasoning and looking at people. Well, unfortunately, what are we doing? We're damaging that. it just seems like everything we do, we turn around and we're damaged. Oh, my favorite is vitamin D levels. Scotland gives free vitamin D to its people because it's a national health service, and they'd rather have you not suck off their pounds from the health service budget. So they know that if you keep people's vitamin D level up, they're less apt to get sick and have cancer, and a lot of bad things happen to them. But what do we have going on in this country? When doctors were waking up to this and saying, hey, this normal lab where it says you can be 20 to 80, that's way too low. You probably normal ought to be more like 50 to 120 or something. It's more than, we should have higher levels, and we need to be taking more vitamin D. Well, and so they were pushing now in the official orthopedic literature for healthy bone, they're saying 5,000 international units a day. It's gone from, 400 to 1,000 to 2,000 to 5,000, and I take 10,000. I think you're seeing a trend here. It's going to continue. Well, guess what? The Institute of Medicine a few years ago comes out and says, oh, no, you only need 400 a day. And I can tell you as an orthopedic surgeon, 400 a day is not enough to prevent adult rickets, a disease we think of as children. But I see it in adult, especially women, all the time, that they say is osteoporosis. No, it's adult vitamin D deficient rickets. There are certain qualities on x-rays. You can clearly see this. So, it just looks purposeful, I have to say. Now, the other point is people say, well, it can't be a purpose. We can't have conspiracies. There are no conspiracies. And to those people, I have 2 points of evidence to talk about. And the first one is in 2011, there was a guy named Gladfelter. I think it's Gladfelter is his name. He's a Swiss economist or Swiss guy who he and his team looked at the 37 plus million companies in the world. Corporations, there are over 37 million corporations in the world. And then they looked at common ownership. How many are really owned independently? And they boiled it down. They put it in a supercomputer, and they boiled it down to about 3,200 companies, 3,100 and some. And then they hand selected some things and reprocessed the data, and they got it down to 147 companies. And then somebody from Forbes looked at that and researched it further and said, well, actually, those are owned by 10 financial companies, corporations. And then somebody else looked at that and said, when you really understand how funds system, these big funds work, you can really narrow it down to 4 big companies in the world that own all the corporate wealth. And those people and those 4 companies are essentially run by 150 men. It says to you that there are 150 men who essentially own 60+ % of the world's corporate wealth. If you don't think you can get together, if you don't think that 150 people can get together and do bad things or good things, that's not unreasonable.
The time to defy the modern agenda is now. UI Media Network presents Frequency Wars, an explosive new series that examines contentious subject matter pursuing us beyond our 5 senses. This weekly series discovers the intricacies of imposing issues that challenge our daily existence and question humanity. Provocative and intriguing, we confront the issues and conflicts affecting us on a global scale. Manipulation, manpower, or others simply controlling your mentality. The commentary and guests will shift our paradigm and defy the status quo.
In 1979, the so-called father of Israeli intelligence, a guy called Issa Harel, told an American journalist that there was going to be an Islamic attack on New York's biggest building.
Bill Gates, he is publicly saying we should consider microchipping all of humanity so we can track their vaccination status.
What you see in movies like The Avengers, that's actually true.
What will you believe? Frequency Wars challenges perception to take back your sovereignty. The power and purpose are greater than any of us, but we will test it all. Frequency Wars, the next revolution.
Welcome back to The People's Truth with Tia Severino. We've been watching my interview with Dr. Lee. She was making a great point before the break about conspiracy theories and how the term is used to discredit and dismiss anyone questioning the official narrative. But it's not that hard to see how only a few people with power at the top can cause a lot of trouble for a lot of people. She's also about to talk about Enron in this section coming up. And I wanted to say that during this so-called energy crisis, I was living in California and I kept telling everyone, look, I do not believe that there is an energy shortage. This is just a scam to raise our electricity bills. And I was really angry about it because who did it hurt the most? It hurt the poor, the lower middle class who struggle as it is to make ends meet. Sure enough, I looked like a prophet or sage when the truth about Enron came out. I was just following my gut. But let's listen in to hear what Dr. Lee has to say in part 2 of my interview with her.
And, you know, it's like Enron. Just the fact that the average person in Enron did not know that Enron Corporation was corrupt and was going to steal everybody's pension plan and go down in flames. A few people on the top knew what was going on, but everything's compartmentalized. And that's the way the world works. It's one big, you know, layer on layer on layer. But at the very top layer, there appear to be 150 people. Think of that. That's unbelievable. And the second piece of information I always trot out is, does anybody know where the term conspiracy theory came from? Well, you probably do, but most people don't. It comes from the CIA. And it was after, the Warren Commission came out about John F. Kennedy's assassination. And people said, wait a minute, I don't believe the data. I don't believe that conclusion. What are they talking about? And so the CIA was given marching orders and they were given on paper. I keep a copy on my desktop on my computer just so I can remind myself, no, I'm not crazy. There really are conspiracies. And the biggest conspiracy was by the CIA to squelch that term. But they were told, if you're talking to politicians or newscasters, do not debate the data of the Warren Commission. Just call these people crazy conspiracy theories, make a joke about it, and it will go away. Well, that was the most, successful CIA program ever. But we're still living with it because it's very easy. If you want to stop an argument, just come up with a derogatory term that catches on. So it's conspiracy theory. Oh, if you don't think that, if you don't believe that all vaccines are always safe and always worthwhile in all people all the time, then you're an anti-vaxxer, crazy anti-vaxxer. For just demanding transparency, safety, you're an anti-vaxxer. You see how it works? And, now you're a quack. I'm a quack because I don't think masks work. And I can show you the science of that. They don't work. They do work for some things. They do not work against small airborne particle viruses like this. So that's what they do. They come up with a name. And here's the other thing to say about that. If this were really science, we'd have debates. We'd have people presenting evidence. We'd be able to reproduce the evidence. As we talked earlier, it shouldn't be hidden. It shouldn't be like, do they know this or don't they know this? How come we don't know that they've ever isolated a virus? Why can't people get samples of isolated virus from the CDC if that's true? The question is, if it's really science, we should have open information streams, because if they think we're in a pandemic and this is science, they should be giving us all the information they've got. They're not doing that. And when somebody comes up with a novel idea to treat this that works, that they can prove works, they shut them down, they censor them. Censorship is not science. Okay. This is and the censorship and it's like shaming. The other thing that's not science is shaming people for not wearing a mask. That's the act. That's cult actions. A cult shames people that don't share their worldview. They separate the world into people that have our religious belief in the cult versus everybody else. And if you don't have that, then they shame you and say you're immoral or you're ugly or you're evil or something. And that's what's happening. So we're not dealing with a scientific argument here. That the reason people feel confused is it is confusing because it's not being run for science, and it's not being run in our best interest. It's confusing to me too, but not because now I believe it is a conspiracy, so I'm not so confused.
I absolutely embrace the term conspiracy theorist, because those folks that were questioning the JFK assassination were right to question it, because it wasn't what it appeared to be.
Right.
The
You see
official
that,
narrative that was presented to us was not what it was supposed to be. So I embrace it. And if people
absolutely.
tell me
Good for you. Well, remember, first it was JFK, and then it was, oh, wait a minute, before JFK even, it was communists. Oh, if you think communists are in our government, then you're crazy, like the people on the House Un-American Activity. You're, what was the Senator Joe McCarthy? That was a term I forgot. The term McCarthyism was actually brought to bear by a guy who was a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist who turned out to be in the pay of the Soviet Union. So you can't make this stuff up, but Venona transcripts tell us this. So bottom line is that, yeah, first you were a McCarthyite, and then we went on to these other things. So there's always something, whatever they don't want you to know about, they make a derogatory term for. And I think it was interesting. I was on a plane with a guy. He's an engineer from Taiwan. And he told me, he said, the reason we didn't get hit with this virus, we don't listen to anything the Chinese say officially. What we do is we watch what gets censored, and then we follow that. That's what their official government policy on Taiwan is. They watch. That's a smart thing. So I embrace that too. I think if they're calling somebody a conspiracy theorist, what do they not want him to say or her to say? If they're censoring something, maybe it's something I need to read. It's definitely something I need to read or I need to watch. Yeah. So you're right. And look at all the things that have been. There were communists in our government. Alger has proved that, right? There were most people do think that it wasn't just Oswald now in the even big Hollywood people in the JFK assassination. UFOs. If you ask the average American now that used to say, "Oh, you crazy UFO conspiracy," the nutcases, everybody's starting to think they're UFOs, right? It just goes on and on. So now the mask deniers will be proven right because science is on our side here. And the people that say, "Oh, follow the science," they really don't want you to follow the science, because science isn't shaming or censorship. They want you to follow scientism, kind of their religion about this stuff. That's what's going on.
I agree with you 100% on that. I want to dig in a little bit to something that you were talking about a minute ago. When we say that, and I understand you're talking about Koch's postulates, right, when it comes to the virus isolation of a virus, but if we haven't actually isolated the virus for coronavirus, how for the SARS-CoV-2 that supposedly started in Wuhan, that spread around the world, these vaccines that are supposedly for the SARS-CoV-2 virus, specifically the mRNA vaccine. We could talk about the difference between the mRNA vaccine, which is the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines, versus the Johnson vaccine that was just granted emergency use authorization, which is using an adenovirus. But let's just for a minute, let's talk about the mRNA. They're injecting you with something that is supposed to trigger your body's, and I may not be saying this right, but I think it's the transcriptorase process by which your body takes and replicates the DNA. So we're inserting our mRNA to try to get the body to do that and make this protein. So what on earth is it that they are injecting us with, that they're trying to trigger our own cells to make this protein if we haven't isolated this virus? That's just a
well, that's right. Now, see, here's the thing. There may then, and it's not just about Koch's postulates. It's really because when they don't completely apply, I think, to viral isolation. Again, this is at a level a little bit above my pay grade of biology understanding. But what I will say is that they determined through some process of sampling and using PCR lab data, which the PCR test was made to be a lab to identify certain sequences. And what they did in these people from Wuhan is they found sequences early on that correlated with the old SARS. And so they said, aha, maybe this is a new SARS. And so they got several of these, and it's kind of like if you, and I've heard somebody else say this isn't my analogy, but I think it's a good one, that they have a giraffe and they think it might be a giraffe, but they don't have all the parts of a giraffe isolated, right? They've got a hoof over here, they got part of a horn, they got a nostril, and maybe, the front leg. We don't, and what they did is they have pieces that all can plug and play into a SARS virus, and maybe with some little variation. And then they put it in a computer model, and a bunch of these scientists kind of voted on what they agreed upon as the probable looking of this thing virus. Now, if the problem I have with all that is, I don't really have a problem with that in general, except there's two things. One is I can't figure out, do they have 20% genomic, did they actually, in other words, could they actually detect 20% of the genome or 99%? If you only make up a computer model and agree upon a 1%, that's one thing. If it's a 95%, that's a totally different thing. That's coming up with a giraffe based on the hoof and the horn. So I can't figure that one out. It shouldn't be this hard, but I can't figure out how much of the genome. And if there's somebody out there that can tell me, I'd love it. Should send me the paper. But the biggest issue here is, let's say they did find that when you look at PCR tests, like in people's nose, and you look at it in different places, that there may be a coronavirus like this that's out there that everybody's all, exposed to all the time, that gives us a positive PCR test, but it isn't what's causing the disease. The problem is we're defining the disease symptomatically. And then we're not using what I can only say Dr. Kaufman shows us is not proper isolation techniques to say, there's the virus. He says we're selecting out what we think it is before we really test and see, is that really it? In other words, we're not doing the way we should to really figure out, is it that disease that's causing or is it that virus causing the disease? And here's why that's important. So they just came out with a paper, and the paper is actually from the NIH, I believe. And it just came out showing that they're trying to convince you that the vaccine is just as good as natural immunity, right? So what they did, and the other question they're asking is, does the vaccine cover all the variants of that we're finding different variants of this virus, right? So this is a very technically sciencey looking article, and it goes through and it shows they took people that were acute convalescing from this disease we're calling COVID, based on symptomatology and a PCR test, and people farther out in the disease. So two groups of people that have had COVID in the hospital, they sampled tissue, they sampled their nose, and it says PCR antigen in one of the groups, so it's probably all PCR. You don't know if any of it's really antigen. They could have done one antigen study and all the rest is PCR, but in any case, they showed that those people had antibodies to all. 95% was their number, which refers to something. It's the exact same number of neutralizing antibodies. I guess it's a percentage of neutralizing antibodies to all four variants of the virus if you've had COVID. Okay, 95% neutralizing antibodies, which is what you want, to all these four variants. And then they go over and they look at people that have had the vaccine, the Pfizer vaccine. And they looked at the four different variants there. And guess what? It was exactly 95% in them too. Now, the first thing I have to say, the first red flag that went up is, I don't believe that those should all be the same numbers. What's the chance you have exactly the same percentages in exactly the same groups, even in nature, but especially comparing nature to this artificial product, right? That you're inducing an artificial immunity, not the natural immunity. So the chance they're all the same, I think, is a little bit improbable. But even so, here's the biggest catch here. They go through in grim detail how they did this technically. But what they didn't do is test these people that they gave the vaccine to before they gave the vaccine and see if they also had 95% of all those groups. Because I could give you a scenario in which there is no COVID, there's no SARS-CoV-2, and everybody has those 95% groups in both the people that were sick and the people that were not sick. That's because what we're testing for is an airborne virus that everybody gets, and it doesn't make you sick. The real problem here is going from these positive PCR tests to what's making you sick. And that's a big leap of, faith, not so much scientific integrity, I think, at this point. So then a question is, what is it? What's the vaccine? What's the so-called vaccine too? And I am more familiar with Moderna and the Pfizer than I am with the Johnson & Johnson. It's a little different technique. But here's what the way it works in the Pfizer and the Moderna. First of all, it's an experimental emergency use device. And every time that's been tried in the past that I know of, it's been cautioned afterwards. It was a disaster, and they say never, never, never do it. We got Gulf War syndrome from the emergency authorization use approval for the anthrax vaccine. And this one batch of anthrax had squalene, which caused the Gulf War syndrome, which gave these guys a risk of having ALS, a fatal neurologic disease, at 4 times the background rate. Bad deal. Respiratory syncytial virus, rush. It was an experimental thing. They put it out and all these children died. So I'm going to tell you, we don't do well with these rush deals, and we shouldn't have done it here. But beyond that, the way it's supposed to work is, instead of you being exposed to naturally occurring coronavirus, which has a spike head on it, by the way, that's why they call it corona, it means crown, and getting natural immunity, that we give you not, and the way you would do it, if it were a classic vaccine, what you would do is you would give a piece of the corona, take the coronavirus and make it a little weaker to make it not make you sick or whatever, and inject it with an adjuvant, a chemical that makes you reactive, your immune system react, and then you would produce this antibody response theoretically to this naturally occurring virus. That's not what they're doing. What they're doing is jumping the steps so they don't have to grow a pathogen. See, growing pathogens are expensive. That's an expensive step. So this way, what they can do is they literally make synthetic RNA. They program, RNA is like a programmable genetic molecule. I can make, like when they sequence the human genome to find out what made us our DNA, what makes me different than you, they've got these little devices now that can tell you the whole genome, the sequences of it. And then they could, if they wanted to, make RNA to parts of those sequences, because RNA is like the inverse template from DNA. So what they did is they took, this is what they told you they did. They said, we took the spike protein of SARS-CoV-2 and we retro-engineered mRNA. And then we give it to you, and then it goes to your little ribosomes, the little parts of your cell that make proteins, and it reproduces literally the spike protein of this pathogen in your cells. And now we hope your antibodies will come out and learn about it and attack it and won't let you get sick right now. It's kind of creepy. So here's one of the big problems right away. In reality, let's say I get sick with this. We'll, for the moment, let's just assume there is a SARS-CoV-2 and it is giving us this disease. We're going to assume that, even though it may not be true. Let's just assume it for this point of order. Let's assume it. The way I get it, it gets into my nose and my body starts making antibodies right away. I mean, I start, and tissue immunity, which is even better than antibodies. My immune system goes on to drive, a little overdrive, to try and take care of this virus. And in most cases, it does that. But in some people, just like flu or anything else, in some people, it gets away from them. Then they start having the virus replicate and make copies of itself in multiple cells, maybe down in your lung. And in this virus, possibly in places that have these special ACE2 pathways, your brain, your heart, your testicles, your fat cells, okay? But it had time to make some immune response before all that happened. Now, what they're doing is they're giving you an injection of this synthetic RNA that produces pathogen, this virus spike protein all over, who knows how many cells all over you, and you've had no warning. It's like boom. It's like a huge explosion of virus particles now suddenly all over you. And that's why I think we're seeing, one of the reasons that potentially you're seeing these old people die after the first vaccination, because they can't mount a quick enough, effective enough immune response. I mean, nobody knows for sure, but this is my thinking, is I think some of those deaths are probably people whose immune response is impaired. And so they're not helping their innate immunity. All they're doing is giving them a pathogen to go after. So it's like if I wanted you to be immune to staph and I injected you with, everybody knows what staph is. It's a germ that gets on your skin, doesn't make you sick, but if it gets in and makes an infection, it makes an abscess. What if I gave you that just into your bloodstream? I just injected you with staph in your bloodstream and just let it fly all over the place and say, okay, now you're going to be immune. Well, maybe, or I'm going to be dead of staph sepsis. You see what I'm saying? That's one of the things that's a problem here. The second problem is when they say that, okay, we're going to make this antibody response. We've got this mRNA, and it's to the spike protein of SARS-CoV-2. Well, what's different about the spike protein of SARS-CoV-2 is it was genetically upregulated. They did some specific gene splicing, which we can identify. And of course, the people that did identify this were shut up. But there was an Indian researcher, Pradhan Prasham, I think is his name, and his group immediately saw this and said, we've seen this, this, and this. That's classic Chinese lab gene splicing leftovers in this. So we think it's, and this is what we saw. And this is, anyways, and there were patents of this years ago where they gene spliced the head of the coronavirus, the spike, in these specific areas to create cleavages. They're called furin cleavages. That's what makes this thing so deadly to some people, maybe. Again, I'm assuming this is what we have going on here, is that they're perfectly fit to your ACE2 pathway. So it's like a lock and key. This thing was upregulated, so now instead of the spike protein not fitting the ACE pathway, it fits right in there and gets into your deeper tissue quicker. That's what seems to be what's happening. But in any case, so now we don't know exactly what they're making the mRNA to, because there have been no independent tests of there's no been, as Judy Mikovits said to me, there's no independent sequencing of this genetic material in the Pfizer or Moderna vaccines. That's what would have happened if there'd been time for independent review. That's why they rushed this through, I think. Rush. No time for public comment, no time for independent review, no time for even review of the science very much. So that's really where we are with this. Now, what I will tell you, we're seeing a lot of problematic things with those vaccines and the AstraZeneca, which is basically similar. So what are we seeing? When any bad drug or any new drug comes out, and I won't just say bad drug, but any drug comes out, theoretically, the drug companies themselves have tested it, and sometimes it takes on average 15 years to get a drug to market. So they've tested it, but they've done it on a fairly small sample size. We never really know it's completely, there's probably no completely safe drug, but we never know really the risk factors until we really use it on a lot of people. Usually we sort out the really bad drugs by using it on a smaller group of people, several thousand, before we ever release it to the population. But this time we're going full bore, full steam ahead, whole population, right? Millions of people. And then what they do is anytime there's a drug problem, they always use the same arguments. Well, okay, yeah, some people died of anaphylaxis, but it was only a few, and we've given millions of doses. That's always the first response. But the real problem here, we learned this with thalidomide, we've learned this with a bunch of other drugs. You should always look at what's unusual. Okay, if you give a new drug, even if it's a rare side effect, if it's nothing you've seen before or it's something totally unusual, you should stop back and take a thought. Because by the time you start seeing patterns, this is already off and running. So let me just mention, it's easier to understand thalidomide, which we have now history of and we know what happened. The thalidomide was a drug developed in the 50s. It came out in the 50s, and it was actually for pregnancy nausea. Now, nobody dies of nausea, but what happened when they took this drug, it caused very bad birth defects because they were using it in the first trimester. And this is what gave us a generation of children without arms, without toes, without legs, without they made ring kind of constrictions, and you would sometimes have either no or partial limb amputations. But the problem is when it first started using it, the drug seemed innocuous enough straight up, didn't make people sick, it helped the nausea, so they were giving it. And then maybe an OBGYN doctor in, Liverpool saw one case of a baby being born without a foot, say. But that's the only case he saw. So he didn't put it together. He'd given a lot of people the drug. He didn't put it together. And then the next case was in India. The next case was in Ireland. And then, you see they're very scattered. And nobody was reporting it because they'd only seen one case. But then they might have seen, when in big groups like in the city, they start seeing enough cases, then they start getting suspicious. Then they start talking with each other. And finally, by the time they figured it out about the thalidomide, lots of babies had been born with defects. It's like a small little snowball that gets rolling. And what we need to do is better identify that snowball before it becomes an avalanche. So here's what we've got going here. We are seeing a couple unusual things. First of all, we're seeing a lot of miscarriages. Now, again, considering how many women there are out there and considering how many women are pregnant and the average of 10 to 20% miscarriages in pregnancy, you can say, well, it's not a very big number. But what's unusual about it is its temporal association to the giving of the vaccine, like 4 days after you get the first dose, for example. And the fact that it happens in all trimesters, not just the first trimester, which is where most spontaneous miscarriages happen, or the last. It's unusual to have a second trimester miscarriage, but in this case, it seems to not matter which trimester it is. I'm looking at the numbers, and we don't have all that data yet, but we're looking at the VAERS numbers. I'm an assistant that's helping me with this. So that's unusual. And I'm not an OBGYN doctor, but my friends who are tell me that's unusual. So we should look at that. We have women in Israel, they're reporting a lot of pregnant women bleeding and in the hospital just being watched. The other thing that's happening, which may be related to this, is that we're having platelet abnormalities that I've never heard of before. I mean, the first time I looked at this, it was like this doctor that was 56 or 57 years old. He was an OBGYN doctor, surgeon down in Florida, and he died 4 days later with no platelets. He took the vaccine, first dose, boom, no platelets after 4 days. What went on there? Now, there is a disorder called idiopathic thrombocytopenic purpura that means your platelets drop down below like 50,000. They get low, and you start having purpura, means bruising. You start having spontaneous bleeding, spontaneous bruising, right? But usually, that doesn't kill you in 4 days. And no doctor friend that I've talked to has ever seen that kill anybody in 4 days, even in training when we saw a lot of different cases, right? So that's something that it's usually bone marrow suppression. Either you can find the problem and get it to come back, or you can supplement people with platelets for a number of years before they die with it. So whatever we're seeing is totally different. So even though we've only seen maybe 50 or 60 cases now, that's still, and we've given over 41 million doses. Yeah, not very big numbers, but it's unusual. And the other thing the other thing I'm seeing and I'm hearing about is brain bleeds. And this is one that's going to be very hard to be realized by doctors, because a 72-year-old takes a vaccine and 2 days later has a brain bleed and dies, okay? Unfortunately, hemorrhagic stroke is more common in elderly, and it can just happen. So they're not putting it together. They see a 70 or an 80-year-old person in a nursing home that dies of a brain hemorrhage. They're just not going to think it has anything to do with the vaccine. What we really should have been doing with the flu vaccine, and what we should have been doing for decades, have been looking specifically at all-cause mortality in nursing homes and their relationship to the time of death and the peaks of death per capita, the rate of death after flu vaccine and after these vaccines are given. And now we should, unfortunately, the good news is it's unfortunate for the people that have died, but we're seeing an outbreak in nursing home deaths right after the vaccine, to the point that people in countries are stopping the vaccine until they have more data, especially in these elderly people. So I think we're starting to see enough that we know there's something going on here. And that's really where we are. And I don't know. The other question I always get is, does it really get into your DNA? So the RNA probably does not, but here's the little dirty secret. RNA, even in nature, RNA is what's called an epigenetic regulator of DNA. In other words, your body produces little snippets of RNA that not only, RNA doesn't just go out to your ribosomes and produce proteins, it feeds back on your DNA and produces changes. So it could express genes, for example, maybe cancer genes. We don't know. Maybe it could suppress anti-cancer genes, cancer protective genes. Maybe it could methylate your DNA, which is a permanent three-dimensional conformation damage that never gets recovered. We just don't know. See, those are the unknowns, lots of unknowns here. So that was a long explanation, but that's, you've got all I know about this what's going on here. But that's why it's so important. VAERS is not perfect, the vaccine adverse event reporting system, but I advise people, if you've had a loved one or you yourself, or you know somebody, you know, a neighbor or family member, you saw them have the vaccine, they were perfectly healthy, and then 2 days later they're dead of something, report it to VAERS. You know, let the numbers and data sort it out. If you constantly are being told ahead of time it's not significant, then we're not going to figure this out, you know?
If this content resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel at uimedianetwork.org to stay updated with our uncensored shows. Also, like and follow us at UI Media Network on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Twitter, and almost all your favorite podcasting platforms. Most importantly, if you're being censored on social media, write to us at contact@uimedianetwork.org to get your message out. And remember, keep raising that frequency.
Okay, so last question. I'm sure by now I'm not the only one. Many people, I'm seeing reports from friends who are finding their loved ones, friends, family members are getting the vaccine.
Right.
And I've been, because I have 2 vaccine injured children, I'm vaccine injured myself, and I've been trying to detox, and my son has really come a long way. I mean, like, he luckily only got 4. They were all before he was 6 months old. My daughter has a much harder recovery for her to go through because she was born in 1990s. She got the whole, she got the 90s schedule. Although I didn't dose her like they want to dose babies now with 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 shots at one time. But I'm having to deal with, you know, how am I going to get the mercury out of her because she got the 90s schedule. But I've heard others say, and so I'd like to get your take, that there's no coming back from this COVID vaccine. It literally will change. You may not be able to recover from an injury from the coronavirus vaccine that they're pushing now. What would you say to someone if you found out that someone that you cared about had gotten the vaccine? I would like to hear what is your response? Because my response is, are you kidding me? We talked about this a million times. What are you doing? Stop! Don't do that. But what is your response, and how would you approach talking to someone who has either gotten the first dose and needs to get the second dose, or who has just completely ignored your advice and gotten both vaccines? What do you say to those folks?
Well, I think the first thing to say is this isn't political. You know, for people that are being pressured to take it by their relatives, or they think it's noble if they take it, why do you think it's noble? I mean, what is this idea that you're showing how brave you were and got it on? Like, all of us are just idiots that are speaking about the risks. I never tell people don't do this medicine, don't do that medicine. I say, look, here's what I think is informed risk and benefit. So here we're talking about a disease that worldwide was 99.991% survivable. This is not the pandemic of 1918. This is not smallpox. This is not polio. You know, these are not fatal disease. If you have a fatal disease out there that, like smallpox, is 60% fatal, 60, not 6, not 0.0006 or whatever. It's 60% fatal. And that starts spreading around, it's over. You know, so I've always been in favor of smallpox vaccines, but this is not that. So the best thing you can say is, at least it's not an emergency. If you are thinking about getting this and you think we're all crazy people and that this is just all Trump and the non-Trump and the blah, 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 it's all politics, in my opinion, it has nothing to do with politics and everything to do with your safety and well-being. And I just would say, just give it some time, because I think within 6 months, we're going to know what's the real truth here. We just don't have enough data right now. So there's no emergency for anybody, and especially pregnant women, to run out and get this. Okay. You can virtue signal, or you can play politics, or whatever you think it is, all you want to, but it may be irreversible. And that's your point. And it's maybe irreversible in the way I just said that Judy Mikovits taught me of DNA. And if it actually causes your DNA to have permanent conformational change, then you've got a problem that's not going away, and we can't change that. Now, the other issue I'm concerned about is, does it set you up? And this was one of his first name is Geert, and I can't remember his whole last name, but he's this guy that's going around. He's a vaccine researcher, and although I don't share his complete views, I do appreciate him saying, if you give a vaccine like this, an agent, it's a genetic agent, while this thing is circulating, you may kill a lot of people through these different pathogenic, they're called immune enhancement aspects. So my point is that you don't know if you're already, unless you do sophisticated tissue studies, you really don't know if you're already immune. So, if you take this vaccine and it causes what he's talking about, you can die because of an inflammatory overshoot. And we have seen, there was a doctor, an orthopedic surgeon in Memphis, Tennessee, 37 years old in good health. There's no reason he should have taken the vaccine. But again, for every reason, he took it. His chance of dying of COVID is almost zero, but he took the vaccine and he was dead very shortly of multi-system inflammatory disease, multi-organ inflammatory syndrome, MIS they call it. And again, it turns out he'd been exposed. He had antibodies already in his system. He took the so-called vaccine, and he may have had this pathogenic primer and antibody-induced enhancement, whatever, and he just got inflamed and they couldn't save him. So I'm just saying, if you have taken it, because, first of all, don't think that if you've taken one, it's going to maybe protect you more if you take the second one. I don't think that's good thinking. I would make my body so anti-inflammatory as possible. I mean, I wouldn't eat wheat, which is an inflammatory path. It's just by itself a damaging thing. I would do gluten-free diet. I would not eat inflammatory oils. That means any oils that God didn't make, such as canola oil, corn oil, safflower oil, soybean oil, all the man-made squeezed oils kind of things, margarine, Crisco. It turns out lard's okay, but not Crisco. The stuff God gave us, go ahead and eat. We're supposed to eat fats. But the other thing I would not do is I would not, and I would make sure that I would not depend on the sunlight, which won't get your vitamin D up. I would take, and really for this, it's vitamin D, zinc, vitamin C, NAC, N-acetylcysteine, and selenium. If you don't take any others, and quercetin, probably 6 things. Those are things I'd take, and I would just make myself anti-inflammatory. I would really clean up my diet. I'd eat lots of greens and lots of things with vitamin C, and I take vitamin C all day, because it may be in our and the other thing is, it's not a bad idea to have some ivermectin and some hydroxychloroquine in your back pocket. Okay, you can get it offline in Mexico, the different pharmacies. I'm not here giving us medical advice, but I'm just going to say, if this had happened to me, I would make sure I had some of that in my house available, because if I started getting sick, I would immediately start taking some of that. Or maybe I would prophylax myself throughout the winter with 2 hydroxychloroquine tablets a month, just to get me through and I don't get one of these viruses, because it stops at cold. It's good prophylaxis. I don't know. No, the word is not out. But the good news is, if you did something like that and you didn't let yourself go down with some virus taking you out because you got this pathogenic priming, it may be that this only lasts 6 months or 2 years. We don't know that yet. But the fact they're already talking about revaccinating us, either they just want to double down on killing us, or it really does go away, and they know that. So I don't know. But those are what I would tell people. And I really feel bad when people are pressured to take the vaccine by their relatives. Like, you can't come and see the grandchildren if you don't take the vaccine. That's really cruel and inhuman, and it's totally without basis in the scientific risk-benefit analysis. And the other thing I'll say is a total crime against humanity, giving this to children. We know that children, in the UK, in Oxford University, they said, what's the risk to school children of dying of COVID? It's less than dying of lightning. Okay, lightning strike. In Sweden last year, 2020, now compare this to what we did to our kids. In Sweden in 2020, 1.9 million school children didn't miss a day of school, didn't wear a mask, didn't anti-social distance, didn't do any of the things that we did, right? They didn't have their little isolated desks in these little cubicles to terrify them. They just went to school, not one death. And their teachers did not get sick at any other higher rate than the background of non-teachers. So why would we ever risk any risk for those children to take an experimental genetic agent? Are you kidding me? I mean, that's what we're doing. We're now talking about vaccinating babies down to 6 months old. At some point, people have to wake up and realize what they're doing to our children. The masks were bad enough. The masks were a total psychological operation aimed at our children. It was terrible what the masks did to children, and this is now doubling, tripling down on it. I just can't believe it. I mean, even if you believe in even if you're the most rabid pro-vaxxer in the world, you believe that kids should have 70 vaccines by the time they're in high school. How could you justify it for this that doesn't kill them? Now, having said that, because see, they always say, if you really want to know the dirtiest little secret here, if you go back in time, because see, I'm an old fart that studied biochemistry in medical school in 1976, and they taught us different things about vaccines back then. They taught us that vaccines didn't stop measles and mumps and chicken pox and all that. That what stopped them from being deadly to people, and by the way, most of those weren't. It was just measles and rubella and diphtheria and all these things. It was plumbers. It was better sanitation and better nutrition that stopped those things. And that you should get sick with those things and get your immune system activated, but not die. And the way you do that, even in Africa. So what they do now is they mix the death numbers with African babies and African children to make parents go out and get all these vaccines. And if you really look at Africa, if you supplement their diet, they don't die either. We shouldn't be going out and vaccinating the world. We should be helping to feed them better, helping to improve their nutrition and their sanitation, give them fresh water. That makes sense, not what we're doing.
Once again, I agree with everything that you said. I think I know why they want to give it to the kids, though. And that is because we as a society, we have been programmed to believe that kids have to have vaccines for school.
That's part of the programming.
And so once you get out of school, people stop thinking, I've got to have a vaccine to survive. So then they have to have all these other, they've shown that it's just way, way, way more difficult to get adults to get the vaccines unless it is a condition of employment. People don't wake up in the morning and go, oh gosh, it's the 23rd of March. I believe I need to go get a flu shot or a pneumonia shot or a shingle shot or no. And so when do they have their opportunities to try to push these stupid vaccines? It's when you step on a nail and they try to tell you that you have a potential for tetanus. And but there's another factor of why they want to get it into the kids. And that is the 1986 National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act, which granted complete and total immunity to pharmaceutical companies who make vaccines for the vaccines that they produce, as long as they are on the
schedule.
CDC childhood schedule. And if they are on the CDC childhood schedule, you can be sure that those will get translated down, at least in especially states where they're more draconian, like in California. I think some states have fewer vaccines that are on the schedule that they do force you to have for school. But if it gets on the schedule, then that means that the pediatricians are going to push it and the schools are going to require it. And you are literally, as a parent, held hostage, because if I don't get the vaccines for my child cannot go to school. And that means I can't work, because we've been sold on this lie. This is part of I have to do a show on feminism at one point, because feminism has so
much to do with so many of the problems that we have in society and why they're able to push these crazy scenarios with us. If women weren't pushed out of the home, then women would be able to homeschool their children and take care of their children at least until they get to grade school, right? Nowadays, you have to put your kid in daycare or preschool so you can work. And that's when the vaccine requirements turn into literally they turn children into ATM machines for the pharmaceutical industry.
You're exactly right. You know, I was a military wife during the period of time when I had children. I mean, I'd just gotten out of the military, and we had two boys. And I always joked, I was the lowest paid spinal surgeon in America, probably the world, because I stayed home for 3.5 years and did nothing but raise the boys. So I made that choice, and I think it's the best choice. If I look back on my life, the best things I ever did were not necessarily becoming a spine surgeon. It was teaching them to read. It was the thing I'll appreciate the most later in life. But I have to say, I didn't think about vaccines. I was trained classically to believe in all this stuff, even though I knew the story back then. I just couldn't believe my doctor didn't know the very best. He hadn't looked at the literature and come up with that this is the right thing to do, you know? So when they said, oh, the new thing is that when they're born, they have to get this vaccine and this, okay. And I wish I hadn't done it now, but fortunately my boys are old enough that they didn't get very many, you know, and they got the older style vaccines that were made in, you know, I think a safer way. So, you know, you're right. But I hear people say all the time, I hear these people that are adults say, you know, I can't, they're not going to drag me out of my house and vaccinate me. You can't mandate vaccines. And I said, you know, where were you when they vaccinated your children? They mandated your children be vaccinated, okay? And then where were you when they mandated the nurses be vaccinated with influenza vaccine, which I have a paper on my website about, that I wrote a letter to my hospital years ago saying, this is why I don't think it's right to coerce the nurses to have this. There's no evidence it makes a difference clinically in people in the hospital, and it's not right. And I ran the numbers out of the basic research for influenza vaccines several years in a row when I wrote that. And you know, then they came for the EMTs, and then there was the police, and then it was the firefighters. So it's the story of, you know, I wasn't a Jew, so I didn't stand up until they, you know, I wasn't a communist when I didn't stand up for, and then when they came for me, there was no one left to stand up. That's the story here with vaccines. They've been vaccinating the whole society. So we have been conditioned to stand in line and get the vaccine because we trust these guys like Tony Fauci, and they must be right because they must be making us healthier, right? Well, you know, besides the fact that our life expectancy for the first time in forever has gone down in the last few years. And the fact that even the most diehard guys now are saying, yeah, there's this trade-off. When you vaccinate children with a lot of these things, yeah, it probably is good for them, but they do get more asthma and more autoimmune disease. They have to admit that's true. That's been shown, okay? And yeah, we did find out that the whistleblower did show that they kind of lied about this not having autism associated with the MMR. It turns out there is an association, and, you know, I mean, it just goes on and on. But, you know, ultimately, this is what it boils down to, is people are taking these experimental, unauthorized agents, I mean, authorized temporarily for emergency use only agents, because they have faith, and they have faith in the drug companies. And that's the story I tell them, is the one about anthrax vaccine, and the Gulf War syndrome, because if you understand this story, it will shake your faith a little bit in how they have treated us. And the point about that is that when these guys started coming back with all these symptoms, and it took a while to figure out what it was, it turned out all that Gulf War syndrome came from one batch of the anthrax vaccine that had squalene as the adjuvant. It was a new experimental use, never been used before, and they put squalene as the adjuvant, meaning the little chemical that stimulates your immune system so they don't need to grow as much of the anthrax. Well, the people that knew about this got upset, and they went to the CDC and the FDA, and they told these people, don't ever put squalene we don't want squalene in our vaccines. This is when adjuvants were first getting kicked off. Hadn't looked at thimerosal, hadn't been thinking about autism or any of this stuff at that point. Well, what happened is they said, oh, no, we won't do that. We don't have any, that's not in any other vaccine. Until about 4 years ago, they put it in Fluad, and they didn't tell us. Okay. They said it was MF59, which is the lab denominator, the lab moniker, the number that they assign in a lab, that's squalene. So your doctor, even if he knew about the story of squalene, wouldn't maybe say MF59 and squalene are the same. He may not. So they hide what's in there. And they were willing to put what caused a fatal autoimmune disease back in the flu vaccine that they were giving to everybody, not just of some recruits going over to war. If you trust those guys with your health and well-being, and by the way, now that I'm saying that boldly about the pharmaceutical giants, I'm just going to say, Jeffrey Epstein didn't commit suicide, and I'm not suicidal either. It is a problem. I mean, look at the Tanzanian president. This is the guy who sent the pawpaw in, swabbed for the test off of pawpaw and got positive COVID and started making fun of the whole process. And he showed, and there were 4 things he sent, all nonsense things that all were positive for COVID when this first came around. And he has been vehement about not letting these vaccines into his country. And then he was just found out. I mean, he was missing for a couple of weeks and just showed up dead. So don't misunderstand and don't misunderestimate what they will do to keep this lie going. This is not, we need a lot of people to wake up quickly so we can all be saved here. Not just, we don't want people to be taken out just for speaking up. And that's ultimately, this leads to there's a psychopathy of totalitarianism that creates a false, it's a false reality to push their agenda. And in this case, the false reality is things like masks work, that hydroxychloroquine doesn't work, and that the only way we can be safe, we've been told by multiple people using exactly the same verbiage, is getting these experimental genetic agents, even though they haven't been shown to keep you out, stop transmission. And in Israel now, your risk of dying of COVID is much higher if you take the vaccine. That's the Pfizer vaccine in Israel. So it's a false reality, but they're using it to bring about something that's going to be the worst thing we can identify for humanity. And that's a command and control system from the top down, kids to adults. They know where you are every minute. That's the other thing people ask me, by the way, is this luciferase that they say is in this vaccine. And I don't know if it's in the Pfizer. It was supposed to be in the Moderna. Again, I don't know for sure, but it's a tracking device you can't take out. The idea is it's a chemical that will light up, and they'll be able to use a luminometer and wand you to see if you've had this vaccine. So it only gets worse. So we have to stop this. And yeah. The pseudo lies that they use to prop this up, the longer they maintain them, the harder they are to make them go away, like this masking. And I really did look at all the things I could read about masks, because when that first started, I said, wait a minute, I've been in masks for 40 years of my life in the operating room, but nobody, and I was in the military, and we knew about, gas warfare and chemical warfare and all this and bio warfare and stuff. And I looked at it for the Navy Research Advisory Committee on my own, just to see, what do we know that I need to know for this committee about defense things? Well, never have we talked about being able to contain small particle viruses like this in masks. So what are they telling us? And what I found out is all the papers that really say that does something in this regard are published after 2020, or, they're now. But if you go back in time before that, we never talked about it. OSHA never thought it worked. And in fact, just the opposite. They've shown that they work even less well than we thought they did. They work for tuberculosis, which is huge. They work for Ebola, which is huge. They work against staph and germs in the hospital, which are huge, but they don't work against these.
Well, I think what I've heard is that when you're wearing a mask in the hospital, it's a sterile field, and the idea is to protect the patient from the doctor accidentally spitting or
sneezing or spitting in the wound. Even that, actually, the studies that really tried to look at, do masks work in the operating room? And I'm not sure we've done very many of them. I personally think it's hard to think it won't work, because we know if you accidentally spit in the wound or purposely spit in the wound, which that's another whole story about cancer treatment years ago, that it can cause infections. So we know that. I mean, so I doubt that it's really true that they don't do anything in the operating room. However, they certainly don't keep viruses being transmitted. It keeps blood from and fluids from getting on my face, in my mouth and nose, and it keeps me from drooling and spitting into the wound, period. And same thing with nurses doing wound care. You know, we don't want to infect wounds. We don't want pus and things to be splashed on us.
But people walking around everywhere they go, going to the grocery store, going here, going there, in their car, touching their face, touching the mask, hanging the mask on the rear view mirror, sticking the mask in their pocket, pulling the mask down to eat or drink. Stop already. This is just insanity. It's not.
It's nonsense. And every bartender at every restaurant.
About the virus.
Yeah.
It's about control.
Right. It's about controlling you. Every bartender in every restaurant knows it's nonsense. I mean, you talk to them, they laugh about it because they know, how nonsensical it is. I have to wear my mask in the first 6 weeks or 6 feet into the restaurant, but then I can take it off to sit at the bar or sit at the table. But, if I get up to go to the bathroom, then I have to put my mask back on, and I have to walk by all these tables of unmasked people to go to the bar. That can't be contagion control. And then when I am sitting at the dining room table or at the table in the restaurant, I've taken this cloth mask that's all sopped with all this stuff from all day long, and I put it on my eating surface, right? Put my phone on it. Can't wash my hands because then I'd have to put the mask back on to go to the restroom. And then I touch everything and touch you and feed you some morsel out of my plate. And, it's nonsense. This is not scientific anything. But it's also creating a fear. It's like I assessed a psychiatrist friend of mine. Who are these people that are driving alone in a car in a mask? Really? I mean, no matter what you think that masks, even if you think masks work really as advertised, that doesn't make any sense. Who are these people? And he said, those are Stockholm syndrome people. They're the people that are so afraid and can't figure out, they're so confused about who to believe. They just have latched on to believing everything their captors say about them. And that's what Stockholm syndrome was. You do everything they say to do and then some, so that they'll let me go or it'll be okay. So to be safe, these guys are washing their hands. If they say 30 times a day, I'll do it 50 times a day. I'll put on 3 layers of mask because Fauci says now 3. Maybe I'll put on 4 or 5, and I'll wear it in the shower if I need to. That's the theory. It's to get out of that anxiety. So I do have some sympathy now with them after I've talked to my psychiatrist friend. They're damaged people. They're anxious, and anxiety is a very uncomfortable position to be in. But the way you're going to get this to go away, and that is take off the mask, turn off the television, because that's not helping this at all. It's just drumming and playing on your fears. Stop listening to Dr. Fauci and anybody that's being paid to give you an opinion here. I'm not paid by the drug company, obviously, and I'm not paid by the NIH, and I don't work for an organization that pays me to say something about these devices. So you got to, and that specific recommendation was made after the false pandemic, the false H1N1 swine flu pandemic that damaged 700 plus children and rushed a whole bunch of vaccines to market that we didn't need. And the same thing, it turned out to be a fizzled out, not a pandemic, but they said, where did we go wrong here? I know where we went wrong. We trusted people with make an opinion about these vaccines and these antivirals who had a lot of money riding on them. Well, we're doing exactly that here. And that's what we should stop doing. And save your elderly from the nursing home isolation. That is cruel and inhuman. Nobody would want to be in some of these guys might have survived the Korean War, and now they're in solitary confinement in our own nursing home. It's terrible. So that's my
best friend just lost her father, and he was a Vietnam vet, and he ended up passing away in a nursing home, and it broke
in isolation.
She was trying to get him out of there. Luckily, she had managed to get in.
Well, that's good.
They let her in, but only at the end, right when he was about to die.
It's terrible.
It's heartbreaking. And we could probably talk about this for another 2 hours, but I know that you have an appointment to go to. So before I shut off the recording, I need to know what website to send my viewers to.
Sure.
Find you.
Well, and it's a work in progress. I didn't expect to be in this war like this. So, but it's themedicalrebel.com. And I don't get paid to go around the country and talk to people and try and win this war, because I think it's a war that we have to win for humanity. But I do appreciate when anybody goes to my website, and we have a shop that we sell you pharmaceutical grade, very good quality supplements at a very good price. And we've had cancel culture that complained to our supplier that we were putting their label on our site, which was totally legal at the time. But now we're the reason there are no pictures on some of these things is we have to now switch it over and put in our own private label, which takes a little time. But we appreciate any support by getting yourself as healthy as you can be and helping us at the same time. So thank you very much for having me on themedicalrebel.com.
Themedicalrebel.com. Okay.
Right.
And I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.
Thanks for sticking around to watch this special episode of The People's Truth with Tia Severino. As you can see, Dr. Lee shared a lot of really hot trigger word topics. I don't expect this to stay on social media. You got to get over to uimedianetwork.org and get the link for this episode to share it. The social media overlords are censoring our every move. So we really need your help to get this information out there. So get it out there. And until next time, I love you and stay safe and wide awake. Till next time.
Whoa. My mind has officially been blown wide open. As yours? Keep sharing the show and join us in our mission to educate the world with uncensored truth. As they say, together we are stronger, our voices louder, and the synergy of our actions more powerful. If you have any comments or questions for Tia and her guests, send us an email at contact@uimedianetwork.org. Until then, stay safe, stay tuned. The UI Media Network and its associates take no responsibility for the opinions and statements made by the talk show hosts or their guests.